All right, I'm making this mostly as a personal note, but it might help other people too. I'm calling this planning my parental strategy or something like that. Um, this is what I've come up with for my own ability to parent and raise children and so on. For these particular things, such as discipline and the content that I introduce to my children and so on. So I'll start with the discipline part because that's where it started to begin with as a thought, and then I was like, oh yeah, by the way, this is how I'm going to raise them. So the first part is discipline. Um, my sons will be trained in martial prowess or ability, and I mean hardcore, like actual like knowing how to fight because they've been in things as close as possible to a real fight, kind of training with me when they get older. And purpose will be given to them on when and how and why and who and what to fight and so on. And they will have discipline. And neither, and they'll, and nerdy things too. I will neither have my children um, idiots, or I won't have them defenseless, and I won't have them being rampaging lunatics, and they will not be unloved. As part of a man's role, my sons will be spanked where my daughters are grounded. It won't be for talking back to me. It'll be for like hitting their sisters or something like that. This is to teach them to endure pain in discipline for good reasons, for justice's sake, so they may protect their children, their wife, their sisters, their nieces and nephews when they get to my age. Social isolation for a woman is similar to corporal punishment. I believe that's just physical, hence corporal, as in of the body, punishment for men. It's how they best respond in some senses. Limiting a teenage daughter's contacts to family and neighbors for a time, i.e., grounding, or spanking a young son, or taking their Xbox away when they're older, is sort of similar. The goal is discipline early prevents later deviations to the extremes away from what's good. So if you instill discipline by habit to begin with, without being cruel, because I've suffered that. I know the problems of physical punishment like spanking for boys and stuff like that and so on that people talk about, but I've also got a love-hate relationship with the spankings I've had basically, where it's like they did teach me to be a very tough man. That was important later in life, and that's actually necessary, so that you can endure the hardships as a man, so you can be there for the woman and child to protect and provide even through suffering. That's actually necessary as a man to be a good man. But you don't want to be cruel about it because that causes the problems I face myself later in life with acting out and total disrespect of authority, even when it's valid, and so on for a time period because of the abuse I suffered. So I'm not saying I'm going to abuse my children. I'm going to discipline them and so on. But I'll get to the next post, which I think will explain my particular philosophy on this. Note also, this means the son learns the appropriate use of violence, and the woman learns the necessity of those closest to them in actuality. Neither is without completely, even when they're grounded or spanked. I will allow my sons, for instance, if I take away their Xbox later in life, to go to their friends' houses to use the Xbox, even if not using it at home for a while, so that it encourages socializing with other people. So it's not going to be it's going to be a punishment to take their Xbox away specifically, but if they can always go to a friend's house and use their friends, and that's fine because it encourages them to get along with other people and so on when they're not like evil. the the other people are evil or something. Um, I won't be domineering in my tutelage or tutoring of school topics to my kids. I'm not sure how to word it exactly, but I've got a dose of inspiration from my dad and my adoptive grandfather, Leland Donald. As matter as a matter of life lessons and disposition, natural disposition of mine, I will tease and challenge my kids, but I will also reward them for effort consistently. Genuine effort will be rewarded. While grades matter, I will be teaching how to think, which will last longer than my life in their lives, and set up for future success without my lording over them. I will teach them to be excellent in what they do, how they do it, who they do it with, why they do it, and how what they do. And I will teach them traditional roles, but I will give them, my sons and daughters, a little bit of appreciation for. It's not going to be totally hard roles. It's going to be an emphasis of roles. They'll get a little taste of the other's experience, maybe, and they'll be labeled as such. But it will be like a special occasion or something, a special situation where it's like this is what they're dealing with, and so on. Sort of like this Flintstones episode where what's his name? Yabba Dabba Doo guy, Fred Flintstone and Wilma Flintstone switch places for a day or something, and then they're like, "Whew, wow, the other person has what the other person was right. I want to do the job I've always been in," and so on. So that's going to be how I'm going to teach it, sort of. So they're going to get a taste of the other roles, sort of, in an appropriate manner. But I'm not going to like shove them down that route. I'm not going to like pretend my kids are trans or something like that. I'm not going to do that confusion. It's going to be a specially labeled situation so you know how the other person is, what they're dealing with, so you appreciate it, so that there's a better communication and appreciation between them and their future wives and so on. Alas, due to the unworthiness of the school system these days, I will need to review their assigned homework to contextualize bad teachers and their propaganda. I will actively push against propaganda from the teachers in my kids, and doing the right thing when they do the right thing will be rewarded despite any punishment they receive on their grades and so on. So I'm going to teach them to be principled even when the authorities are against them, which is what I've. That's not the blind disrespect of any authority whatsoever. That's the principled respect of proper authority in its right place, and the disrespect of bad authority, abused authority, and so on. A very tough-minded approach. I have a sneaking suspicion my kids will become super-based, despite all the human resources Herodins and feminist professors, even if they go to university, which I will generally discourage most likely, unless they specifically want to go to STEM fields or something like that, because YouTube and other sources have a huge amount of like the soft sciences and stuff like that, and so on. But unless my kids absolutely want to go into a super amazing field that like they don't like and specialize in it or something like that, there's a huge body of ability to be self-taught, like I have been over the years, that they can partake in for the liberal arts and so on. So unless they want to specialize into that one field as like an actual like chemist or like neurobiologist or something, it'll be STEM fields or they won't go to university. They're not going to take feminism classes or something like that. They can self-teach feminism if they really want, but I'm not going to let them be propagandized for a lot of money. I'm not going to let myself be costed a lot of money to propagandize them into a dead end um, uh, a dead end education path with a huge debt burden. I'm not going to let that happen to my kids. I'll teach my kids alongside my wife our senses of humor and playfulness, but also respect and love in due parts, and the proper relationship between a man and woman who love each other, and so on, and age appropriate gating to topics and contextualize them as they're introduced. I'm going to be more liberal than other typical reactionaries, but my dad's approach was slightly too hardcore, and my grandpa was too soft, even though the combo was fairly good overall between the two of them. Overall, I'm not going to lean much on other people other than neighbors, friends, family, and wife to raise my kids, and I'll be very involved with them. I'll get them to have their own thoughts, though, a very soft touch, unless they make a critical error on something very serious. Then I'll give them a stopgap hard no to that one thought, and then I'll figure out how to explain it better later if I can't do it immediately on some level. And this is important because I'm teaching my kids how to think, essentially, not just what to think. That way they're not going to fall prey to like charlatans and demagogues and like grifters, stuff like that. Like they're not. It's going to be very involved because I'm a parent, not an indoctrinator, and that's the difference. I'll introduce my kids to Conan the Barbarian and Conan the Destroyer. So Conan the Barbarian is about like the purely masculine, self-driven self, and Conan the Destroyer is more like how to serve the feminine properly. It's more toned down and stuff. It's not got nudity in it or anything like that. But I'm going to give them a taste of the Unga Bunga caveman, and then I'm going to follow it up with the right approach to woman kind of thing of Conan the Barbarian, essentially, with Conan the Destroyer. So I know it's people are disappointed it's not real Conan or something like that, but at the same time, it's like I find this actually kind of helpful, that particular dual setup for a movie, for two movies with Conan, Arnold Schwarzenegger as Conan, and so on. To teach them masculinity and then what it's for, sort of. At about 13. Lord of the Rings at 10. James Bond is more going to be 15-ish. I know younger kids can understand some of it, but I want them to be introduced to it when like some of the stuff actually like hits them like on their level, basically, so they get the in-jokes and stuff. Mythology and historical epics and stuff will be a constant from 8 to 18 years old, at least 8 years old to 18 years old. I've got a personal library concept list of books when I'm better off to raise my kids with, and for personal enjoyment and stuff like that. Since I'll be a hardcore gamer again in the future, I think, and I've been one for a long time over my 40 years of existence. I mean, I was using MS-DOS when I was like 4 or 5 years old, so like, that's like 35 years of gaming, I'll have a list of games that I've actually already played and enjoyed that I can age gate for my future kids that are enjoyable. 1950s and 60s films mostly are age appropriate from 7 to 10 onwards, and there's a full library of a decade or two worth of films and so on, and I can do the other later decades films too as appropriate, but the ones that get into serious topics like The Searchers or Red River or something like that are appropriate for a 7 to 10-year-old, whereas modern stuff that tries to be adult is very not quite grotesque, sort of grotesque, but more like in your face about like having naked people or something, and like inappropriate stuff for a younger child and so on. that sort of flashbangs them with like the adult content in a way that is inappropriate, whereas the 50s and 60s, while a bit more moralistic, made it accessible on a contextualized and moral framework style for younger children to grow up into. And then as they're older, they begin to understand the subtle context of what it means for the searchers when John Wayne says, "I found her." The woman in the dress is actually an Indian war brave warrior who's wearing her dress, and I found her in the canyon. And then the guy says, "Was he?" Or she, and then John Wayne says she's dead, and then the other guy asked, "Was she?" And then he says, "Don't ask me again. Never ask me that question again, as long as you live." And a kid won't understand what that means, but they'll understand it's very serious, more serious than killing. And when you get older, it can be explained that that was basically child rape and then murder, right? So that's like it's about age gating and so on, and subtle coded language for adults to understand. And then the kids can watch the thing without being poisoned in the minds, basically. Narnia, and that's why the 50s and 60s are good for that kind of thing, even if we also need some more explicit adult material for, to some extent, for the people to actually partake in. Narnia and kids' renditions of mythology and the original uncensored fairy tales specifically will be bread and butter for my kids from 5 to 8 years old. Now, I'm doing the uncensored fairy tales because I do not want to lose the important context. And an uncensored fairy tale is somewhat giving what I just said about the 50s and 60s movies in a way, but it's slightly more visceral, but it doesn't exactly point directly to the actual action, so it's not poisoning their minds, it's just preparing them for the harsh realities of living in a savage times and stuff like that. Like Bluebeard or Red Riding Hood or Hansel and Gretel or Sleeping Beauty or Snow White or something like that. I'll also introduce from about 10 to 12 years old science fiction and fantasy books, mostly from the 70s and 90s, but I'll do other books too. I just don't want them to be like I think there was a book called something like Revenge of the Dwarves that I read about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and it had words like rape and cunt in it and stuff like that, and it was like, maybe I don't want the kids to read those books. But some of the more developed books, plot-wise and nuance and stuff like that, of Dungeons and Dragons later on in the series, but still sort of age appropriate for a teenager or an older child up to down to 10 years old, let's say, would be like, that's okay, that's fine. Overall, this total list should provide a good education and numerous forms of decent entertainment from the ages of 5 to 15 years old. And like Day of the Triffids might be an example of like a book that I'll introduce to them at 10 to 12 years old. Once my kids hit 14 to 15, they'll gradually be allowed more and more access to contemporary works than before. My wife, when I get her, and me will drip feed the modern stuff before that, as we decide based on parental discretion. So they'll still get a taste of modern stuff, but we'll be careful to control the modern stuff specifically, because as you know, the guardrails have fallen off, and everything's going all haywire with stuff that's taught to kids and stuff, and some of it's really harmful and stuff like that. Um, However, we'll let them get into the more potentially harmful stuff as they get old enough, after giving them a solid foundation of the proper way of approaching the world from their early childhood onwards. That way, they can mix and match freely the less good stuff and so on. So, for instance, what I was thinking of is, for instance, when my sons hit 14 or 15, I'll introduce them to three movies. I'll introduce them to Mad God, Hellraiser Judgment, that one particular Hellraiser movie, and The Shift. And basically, I'll teach them that Mad God is essentially a story about the Old Testament, and Hellraiser Judgment, despite the fact it's got half-naked women bathing in blood and sort of disgusting stuff like putting your fingers through someone's vomit and stuff like that, I'll teach them the negative theology of, like, this is what it would look like if certain, and I've got it categorized, I mentioned it earlier in my Existential Crisis Guide and Toolkit series, if good needed evil to exist in order for good to exist, is Hellraiser Judgment's problem, essentially, and how it would look like if that were the case, and how wrong that is. And then the shift would be like the whole, like, it doesn't matter how powerful the devil is, God is more powerful than him. And the book, and it's a good take on the book of Job. But it's positive theology in the end, properly made. It's by Angel Studio and so on. And it'll be like the third one I introduce as like the this is how God operates in your life for people He's chosen quite often. So those will be the three adult sort of ish or more adult series. Once I lay a foundation of appropriate work, so that they have a adult framework to work off of after a good childhood and teenage foundation. And this'll let them know, essentially, that I'm not saying you cannot watch adult stuff. I'm saying, and you have to be stuck with the old stuff too, for even the adult stuff. You'll be able to get into the nitty gritty of the more explicit material, and there'll be things about it, because I'm also going to teach them a bit about Carl Jung, or a bunch about Carl Jung and Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau and like Doug Wilson and John Piper and Mike Schmitz and C.S. Lewis and so on. And I'm going to give them a taste of the dark side of humanity, but I'm going to contextualize it in the lighter side of things. And this will make it so that they're not completely naive about how the dividing line between good and evil goes through every human heart. And once they've got a proper foundation for the right way to do things, I'll introduce them to how to discern and navigate when things are less than perfect by a long shot. You know. And that's my development course for how I'm going to parent as a person who is naturally disposed towards a lot of freedom and overly strictness as well in different ways. So it's going to be a hands-on sort of gradualist introduction to more explicit things, eventually. Uh, but it's going to be age gated so that my children know to follow my example and think about it properly, um, and then they can pass it on to their children the same way and same way and same way, and so on, so that there's a continuity of proper parenting, even in the modern age, that encourages laziness or naivety or total abandonment and licentiousness. And the thing is, I'm probably going to let them have like I probably won't let them have webcams for a while, but I might let them on meet online around 14 to 15 years old, without supervision constantly. I'm not sure, because that's kind of what happened with me. Yeah, I know there's a lot of digital ID stuff that people want to put in and force people to ID themselves and stuff to prove they're over 16 and so on, but it's one of those things that's like, honestly, it should be up to the parent, and the parent should actually be responsible, and that's exactly what I intend to do. I might let my kids on earlier than some people, but it'll be later than other people, unsupervised, and so on. But I'm going to give them every reason to trust that I will not deny them things in due time as appropriate, but I will prevent them from going haywire way too early. Because, like, as an example, sex is one of those things adults need to understand, but it's inappropriate for a child and so on. So it's like, okay. But if you introduce the stuff at the right time, in the right context, and so on, and you warn them and you know the ins and outs and you teach them the right way to go about things, then they're not going to be like, you hid that from me completely, I don't trust you anymore. And then you're not going to be like shoving it down their throats when it's going to destroy them. You know. And it's that balance between the two, and it's not just a mushy sort of like, I'm just going to go between the two opposites and like, I'm not going to think about it. I'm just going to go whatever's in between the worst and the best, or the least and most, rather, I guess I should say, in any direction, and so on. Is going to be a very calibrated, because that's exactly who I am as a person, and thought through developmental path based on the lessons of my own childhood and teenagerhood and young adulthood and so on. And it'll maximize their guarding against predators going forwards from childhood, but also minimize their distrust of me as someone to teach them how to live life. So I'm not giving up and I'm not giving in to the world, exactly as the Christians would say. I'm going to interact with the world, but I'm going to keep my thumb on the scales a little bit, or pretty hard actually, I think. But like, I'm going to keep my thumb on the scales even if I let it be weighed out. And I'm going to take responsibility for my children's well-being and behavior and so on, and let them become more and more responsible as time progresses. Basically, just being a good parent, as far as I can tell. You know, I am going to engage with the threats of the world and the opportunities of the world as a parent when I become a parent. And because the world changes in some ways, but the more things change, the more they stay the same in a way too. It's one of those things that is like it's discernment. And also another thing is, I'm not saying this is like a blind like, I'm just gonna let my kids like learn about like sex at like 4 years old or something. But like because my intelligence is rather high, and because my dad's intelligence is rather high, I suspect if my ex, who I believe is rather smart, herself, um, is my future wife, then our children will be rather intelligent as well. So this interactive, engaged approach is actually much more doable for us, and so on. And it's not going to be giving away all the secrets of the universe to make our kids mad from revelation, but it's also not going to be a totally dead inside closed system where they're completely helpless after they turn 18 and are moving out. It's going to be one of those um, sort of engaged but protective parenting strategies, in the sense where we it's sort of like a it's like a it's sort of like a mother cat teaching her sons to hunt or something, right? Like it's got that sort of like element of like, it's that parenting pushing you to go above and beyond your current capacity a little bit, but not too far above and beyond, and then catching you when you fall. So it's like letting the kid climb the tree and then being standing under them, so when they fall, you catch them or something. And then they go, oh, maybe I shouldn't be so uncareful when I climb a tree. But it's important to be able to climb a tree because that's historically how you get away from predators in the forest. You know what I mean? So it's like, there's a whole like thing to this, essentially. And I want my children to be strong and capable in the future, but moral and wise and courageous and enduring or durable fortitude and perseverance, going forwards in the right ways, essentially. And this is my navigation of it with potentially very capable offspring mentally. And you will notice that I'm not actually saying like they're mature for their age, therefore you can put sex in their lives early. It's more like um, it's more like you can put the it's almost like there's a hard gate based on age for certain topics, but the nuances of the topics can be explored better with more intelligent offspring because the parents understand it better and can teach it better. So the age gate is still hard coded, but the increased nuance and wisdom at that level is what intelligence allows you to partake in, and so on. So that's my approach, essentially. Yeah, yeah.